Right, I think I will go ahead and get us started. So welcome everyone, and thank you so much for joining today's webinar, which is being organized by the Research with International Students organization and is part of our panel season. Since February, we've been hosting a series of webinars that focuses around the theme of polycrisis and addressing different facets of polycrisis through our research when it comes to international students. If we haven't met before, hello, my name is Jenna Mittelmeier. I'm one of the co-founders and the lead organizers for RIS, and I'm also leading today's panel session. If this is your first time joining us at an RIS event, I'll put some links in the chat in just a moment so that you can hear a little bit more about us. But essentially, we're a network of scholars whose work focuses on international students, and we aim to create more critical conversations and research on this topic. Today's session is one that I've been really excited about because it speaks really closely to where I think our field needs to be turning its attention, which is on the politicized framings and representations of international students. We included this topic in the series because we felt that around the world, and especially in many common host countries where there are large volumes of international students, there's a growing politicization in the way that international students are being represented by things like the media or national governments, where discourses are becoming increasingly critical of their presence and their contributions to their host societies. So there has, for example, been kind of growing criticality from members of the government or the press or the general public who have brought in at times what can be very disparaging or dehumanizing language to speak about international students, portraying them through assumptions, for example, that they are lower quality students or that universities lower standards to attract them, that they take places from home students, or that they use student visa systems as kind of a so-called backdoors into countries. And these narratives are extremely harmful and problematic. And although they vary across different contexts, what we wanted this webinar to do is to be a space for thinking critically about what these narratives are, how they're impacting different groups of students, and how they're impacting the way people within our general host societies view international students, thinking specifically about where there are problems and inequalities and how international students are framed by different actors. So we've got 4 speakers today who are going to be sharing their work. I'll ask each of them to introduce themselves at the start of their talk, but our speaking order today, we've got Isaac, then Aisling, then Shuang, then Andreas. Our speakers are going to be speaking about a variety of different actors and different spaces where international students are represented. They are, I believe, all speaking from the context of European countries, but we can see a lot of broader implication of these narratives beyond the specific context where their research is focused. I think as we go on, we'd all love to hear in the chat or as we get to the Q&A session at the end, if you can share whether and how you see these same narratives within your own context as well, if you're living or working outside the spaces that they're speaking about. So how the session will work, each speaker will have 15 minutes to present their work, and then we'll come together for the last 20 to 30 minutes for collective discussions with the panel. So please do be thinking about your questions that you might want to ask in that Q&A portion, where you can either write these in the chat for me to read out loud, or you can raise your hand and ask your questions out loud as well. Without further ado, though, I'm going to hand over to our first speaker, who is Isaac. So over to you, Isaac.
Thank you very much. Yes, so hi everyone. I'm Isaac. I actually recently, just a couple of months ago, defended my PhD down at the University of Brighton, and which was all about sort of exclusion and resilience among international students in the UK from a sort of socio-ecological perspective. And what I'm going to talk about today is the sort of first part of that mixed methods PhD, which was a sort of a rapid systematic review of policy literature as it pertains to international students. I'm really looking to understand the social policy context for international students and how these kind of politicized framings of international students serve to enforce kind of exclusion for international students through specific social policy decisions, and also how those policy decisions then also reinforce these politicizations. So I'll try and cover that sort of quickly as I can. So let's see, lovely. Hopefully this is all going through. So yeah, as you probably know, there are about 760,000 international students in the UK, mainly concentrated on sort of postgraduate courses, but obviously not only. And obviously there's a sort of economic element of this. So international students bring various benefits to British universities, society, etc. And because they can charge much higher fees for international students, obviously our universities depend on international students for financial stability. But there's an ambivalent policy space, which I'll touch on a bit more throughout this presentation. But on the one hand, you have things like the International Education Strategy, which was recently updated, which are all sort of articulating for expanded internationalization in this very kind of neoliberal sort of competition framework. But also international students face quite sort of hostile immigration policy rhetoric. And they also face, prevailing acculturation challenges like all migrants, and they face sort of prevailing deficit narratives. So international students are often spoken about in terms of what they supposedly lack. So I just grabbed a couple of, newspaper articles here to give an indication of the ways in which we talk about international students in the UK, right? So you do see these like really unpleasant narratives around, dumbed down cash cows, coverage of, the proposed introduction of a levy on international student fee income. And every now and then you do see, some attention paid to challenges that international students face. And also coverage of the fact that actually, yes, there's no evidence that international students are using graduate visas, for example, but these narratives persist and this feeds into the policy. So what I was specifically looking at, because I'm interested in social exclusion, is, according to the literature, what is the social policy context for international students in the UK, and what are its implications for exclusion for the group, both in general and sort of looking at specific groups. And when I'm talking about social exclusion, I'm describing the state in which individuals cannot fully participate in all areas of life in a society, so economic, social, political, cultural, but also the processes by which this exclusion occurs. It's worth noting I also have a bit of a background in psychology more, and there exclusion is very much talked about in terms of physical, emotional separation from others, which can be experienced as rejection or so sort of outright negative contact or ostracism, so more like being ignored. And it's associated with a host of negative psychosocial outcomes in the short and long term. And why think about social policy? So often because of the, international students are thought of as temporary migrants, and because of welfare chauvinism, migrants in general are kind of excluded from social policy support. There's actually been limited attention paid to international students' need for and access to social policy support. So financial support, support with housing, support with healthcare, all these basics of, fulfilling, individual well-being. And actually literature that covers these issues is quite fragmented because international student studies, as we all know, is kind of fragmented across disciplines. So what I did a rapid review. So this is the first part of my PhD. So the emphasis was on finding out what is the policy space quite quickly. So, a structured Boolean search term, searched a couple of online databases, consulted, government sources ad hoc, so for information about visas, etc. And this search was done, it was early 2023. So this was a while ago, which I'll touch on again a bit later. And, the final set of articles I got from this were, I read them, analysed them, and sort of synthesised them narratively. Because again, it's a rapid review, so it was about getting that initial but quite deep and broad understanding of the policy space. To give an indication of what I was looking for, I mean, this is the search term in the paper, but basically I was looking for papers that mentioned international students, that mentioned the UK, or one of its constituent nations, and then that mentioned social policy or specific policy issues. So maybe they touched on immigration policy, maybe they touched on well-being, maybe they touched on benefits, student loans, welfare, housing, etc. So I was getting this broad overview of the social policy space. And again, yeah, I was looking for papers that mentioned international students and social policy explicitly from 2010 onwards. So for those who know sort of UK politics, that's since the coalition government came to power. That was quite a while ago now, 16 years ago. But that's when we see some of this stuff shifting. And it also provides a bit of an overview. So actually, I had a bit of a historical overview of the actions of some of the governments of the 2000s and earlier, and papers in English, because I am not a great linguist. So overall, I screened 1,683 abstracts, and through a process of sort of screening of abstracts and then full texts, ended up including 42 papers in the review. These sort of pertain to multiple, and this is international students from all countries. So I looked at migration in the UK. Migration and education came up quite a lot, as you would imagine. Most papers spanned multiple policy areas, actually, and most spanned multiple methods, or many used multiple methods, but had papers predominantly qualitative work, but again, there's a mix of methods here. So briefly, in terms of what I found, I've chunked the findings here into sort of areas of policy. Migration policy actually changed from being relatively permissive in the 2000s. So there was this push for, migration and international student migration specifically, became increasingly restricted in sort of 2008 onwards. We've seen the expansion of, barriers to entry and remaining in the UK, expansion, standardization of English language testing, but also, proof of you've got X amount of money, expansion in sort of visa fees. In particular, we've seen things like the health surcharge introduced to notionally cover international students, access to the NHS, which has also been increased as a sort of source of revenue repeatedly. We've also seen the expansion of restrictions in in-country rights for international students. So lack of recourse to public funds, so basically lack of access to any public services that are nationally funded, or rather access to benefits. So things like this might be like student sort of disability additional support allowances. International students don't typically have access to that, but also more traditional mainstream welfare benefits, things like universal credit, and this hesitance to sort of provide international students with publicly funded benefits, even when perhaps within the law that is allowed. And yeah, a lack of home fee status. So international students can be charged basically anything for international education, whereas we have a cap for British students, which used to apply to European students, but doesn't anymore since Brexit. And we've seen the introduction of biometric residence permits as well. So these cards which show your migration status, show what visa you're on, what access you have to what kinds of support, but also serves as, in some cases, a really useful form of ID. So again, some of these moves are kind of ambivalent, because on the one hand, things like BRPs can be quite helpful, but they're used in this way of sort of creating this physical embodiment of a difference between sort of domestic and international students, reinforcing this divide. And yeah, international students have caught up in this sort of hostile environment, migration policy. Non-state institutions, so landlords, healthcare providers, universities, etc., have all become to some degree responsible for border enforcement. And we see in particular, like Levatino's categorization of this as a liberal paradox. So on the one hand, UK society really depends on international students' fees, international graduates' labour, but is actually also simultaneously hostile to the idea that international students might become included in British society. But again, there's positive stuff here. So some universities provide sanctuary scholarships or in-kind support for refugee students, for example, or specific groups of students. There are some scholarships available, so there is some support. Yeah, as I mentioned before, paying the health surcharge does afford international students with access to the NHS, which in other countries would require private insurance. But this is a fee that only migrants face, right? But also there's, some interesting coverage of the ways in which healthcare institutions are implicated in these bordering mechanisms, this policing of the border, and that can result in a hesitance to reach out for healthcare support. And while mental health difficulties such as loneliness, isolation are common among international students, like many students, formal seeking support, accessing support is quite rare, it seems, from the literature. And again, there's a lot about COVID and experiences of COVID and students sort of having to. Sorry, I've gone way forwards. I don't know how I did that. Sorry about that. Yes. So yeah, there's some stuff about COVID. In terms of housing, I mean, obviously housing is central to inclusion, but you see that access to housing in the UK is sort of gatekept by private landlords or universities who, again, are both implicated in these bordering mechanisms. I mean, landlords have to perform right to rent checks, so check the migration status of anyone who rents a house from them. And we see, disproportionate charges and how this affects different groups, for example, disabled international students. I can talk a bit more if you like. But yeah, again, we see this sort of simultaneous expansion of internationalization and marketization in universities. So again, moves in the 2000s, like Blair's Prime Minister's initiatives, really pushed for internationalization of universities and increased international student recruitment, while educational institutions are implicated in this hostile environment framework. For example, they need to check that students are engaging in their studies, for example, monitoring attendance. And you see, there's some interesting discussion about international students' exclusion from certain teaching excellence framework metrics. So the mechanisms to ensure that education is good quality in the UK, often the data collection for this kind of thing, it excludes international students. Limited attention to sort of the educational care needs of dependents of international students, so children, family, etc. And actually the barring of a lot of these family members from access to UK through visa changes. But there's some evidence of some really promising small scale schemes, some really nice stuff about, student-led schemes within universities or library support for international students, both that can sort of deal with the practicalities of living in the UK, but also, the dealing with studying very literally. Similarly to other areas of life, international students face restrictions in work. So there's typically a 20-hour work limit. So restrictions on how much international students can work alongside their studies, and these, in some sort of high-profile cases, have resulted in deportation for international students. And this disproportionately affects working-class students who need to work, right, to fund their studies. They are far more exploitable, which, for example, that leads Howe to categorize international students as a legally constructed underclass of workers, which I think is quite a good term. And we've seen, repeated changes to graduate working visas, increasing the earnings threshold for working visas that, international students who finish their studies might apply for, so that they can stay in the UK and work. But also, the graduate visa route has been closed and reopened and shortened and lengthened multiple times. There's this real discontinuity here. Again, xenophobic and racist abuse is faced by international students, disproportionate for those who, are visibly different, or, for example, singled out based on, Muslim students wearing a headscarf, for example, being singled out for abuse. Some really interesting work on the intersection of gender and racism there. And concerns about aspects of British culture, like drinking culture, are sometimes dismissed. And you see that sort of international students are politicized in this hostile media discursive context. And in terms of inequalities, I'll go into some of this data in the discussion if we like, but I want to point out that there's really two levels of inequality and exclusion here, right? The global working class are overwhelmingly excluded from access to British higher education, right? It's very expensive, requires connections, it's very difficult to get here. Then once here, international students face another barrier to participation in various areas of life, like employment, like access to housing, etc. So there's two levels of exclusion that I like to think about. I summarise some key policies there, but the important thing here is that some of these policy measures because their social policy, they might be intended to support international students, right? But they can serve to also foster exclusion. And yeah, to conclude, I mean, there's this real ambivalent form of internationalization. That's the line I use in my paper. UK social policy provides limited support to international students, often poses difficulties, and different actors are kind of recruited in these exclusion mechanisms. And I would argue that this policy-based exclusion kind of stems from the politicization of international students, but it also reinforces it, right? Because if you see these differences in treatment in policy, this feeds into this idea that this is an other group, right, who we can treat differently. But there are promising avenues for support, and I think it's important to treat international students as democratic equals, and while acknowledging and autonomous people, right, while acknowledging that there are these multifaceted exclusions. I will talk more about recent changes maybe in the question and answers. Maybe someone can ask me about that and I can talk about some of the things that have happened since I finished this bit of work. But we've seen basically a continuation of this ambivalent policy agenda. I think that's about 15 minutes. Sorry if I went a little bit over, but I will end there. And you can read the paper if you'd like to find out more.
Great, thank you so much. If you can put a link to the paper in the chat, I'm sure colleagues would love to follow up with that.
Yes, I'll do that now.
In the nature of time, I'm going to hand us over to Aisling, who's speaking next. But Isaac, you do have a clarification question in the chat from Monica, if you want to take a look at that as Aisling is speaking as well. But yeah, over to you, Aisling.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Jenna, for having me here today. I hope now that you can see my slides.
We can, but you still need to go into presenter mode.
Oh, sorry. Okay, I'm in presenter mode. Thank you very much. So my name is Aisling Tiernan, and I am a postdoc based at the Institute for Sociology at EWTH Aachen here in Germany. And I'm really happy to be here today. I really admire the work of the Research with International Students community, and so I'm just really glad to be able to make a contribution. Today, I'm sharing with you a draft paper that comes from my PhD study, where I looked at the experiences of international students based in the UK, specifically with regards to their navigation of the student visa system. And I want to start today with a contradiction that probably most of us in this space are aware of, and Isaac alluded to some of this as well, where international students are really important in the UK higher education system. Universities promote internationalization and actually spend billions of pounds recruiting international students every year. International students are promoted in prospectuses, and they're celebrated as an evidence of institutional prestige. But at the same time, international students have to prove their right to be at the university throughout their degree, as I'm going to show today. And it's that contradiction that underlines this paper. And so my argument is that international students are not just globally mobile learners, but they're also political subjects, ones who are produced as conditional insiders by the very universities that recruited them. So very briefly on the context, we already saw how the internationalization of higher education has grown and expanded massively from 300,000 students in 1963 to 6.4 million globally mobile students in 2021. International students have become central to university funding, to university rankings and global competition. And one point I just want to concentrate on is the fact that mobility is heavily concentrated. And so nearly half of all internationally mobile students study in just 4 countries, the US, the UK, Australia, and Canada. And of course, the UK is one of these of the world's major destinations for international students, with over 700,000 international students in UK higher education. We make a huge financial contribution, over £10 billion pounds annually to UK universities. And this is all happening within the context of an increased focus on reducing net migration, on an anti-immigration sentiment. We've had Brexit happen. So there's lots going on that kind of coexists with and counter-exists to the focus on attracting the best and the brightest, to use the language of the government, to UK higher education. Now, the empirical basis for my study was that I undertook qualitative interviews with 29 international students across 12 universities. I included students from undergraduate, master's, and PhD levels from 17 countries of origin. And I used a reflexive thematic analysis to identify patterns across participants' accounts of how the visa regime shaped their everyday lives. One point to note is that the fieldwork was conducted some time ago, so I undertook the interviews between 2015 and 2017. And so I addressed the timeline in the paper. And the main point is that although some visa rules have changed, the underlying immigration conditions have intensified. And I also make the argument that it's an example of slow scholarship, where I have taken quite some time to underdo the qualitative work and the analysis that has led to this paper. And just a very brief note on the changeable UK student visa rules. So it was originally called the Tier 4 visa. It's now been renamed to the UK student visa. And there's been lots of rules within that have fluctuated. A graduate work visa was reintroduced in 2021, allowing 2 years post study. Dependents were restricted from January 2024. But the main point I want to make is that that the specific rules change, and they can change with no warning. And so I think that in itself is analytically significant in the paper, whereby students who come to the UK under one set of rules can find themselves in entirely other conditions. And that happened to a number of the participants in my study. In terms of the theoretical framework, there are 3 theoretical threads that run throughout the analysis. So the first is Ahmed's stranger making. And Ahmed begins with a relatively simple question of how do you recognize a stranger? And her answer is that the stranger is not simply someone that we have failed to recognize, it is that they are someone that we have already recognized as not belonging. And so strangeness is produced through what she calls a visual economy. And that is techniques of recognition that read bodies, in which some bodies are already legible as out of place before any individual encounter takes place. And crucially, some bodies are more recognizable as strangers than others, precisely because they are already read as different in the demarcation of social spaces. And this is what I mean by stranger making in the context of international students. It's not that any student could become a stranger student, it is that certain students from certain countries arriving with particular visa conditions are already recognized as not quite belonging from the very moment that they decide that they want to study in the UK. The second thread in my theoretical framework draws on Yuval Davis's concept of everyday bordering. So for Yuval Davis, bordering is not something that happens at the territorial line. It's no longer just at an airport or at a point of entry. It's a multi-level process that operates both at a high level of politics through visa regimes and state policy and in the practices of everyday life. And crucially, she argues that border controls are can be carried out by anyone, anywhere. And she names educational institutions explicitly among the social agencies that are now involved in border enforcement. And that is precisely what I show is happening in UK universities, where, for example, attendance registers, the issuing of confirmation of acceptance of studies letters, compliance reports. These are not incidental administrative practices, but these are bordering practices. And so the university is not a space apart from the border. It becomes a site where the border is being made. And then the third thread for my theoretical framework is draws on de Genova's concept of deportability, where the argument is that it's not just deportability, the possibility of removal. It becomes the possibility of removal and not deportation itself that shapes everyday life. While de Genova is writing about undocumented migrants, which are people without legal status, students in this study have legal status. But what I draw from his study is the temporal logic, so that the border's power lies not in what it does, but what it could do at any moment. So a visa can be cancelled, and a monitoring point can be missed, and this can really result in severe consequences for international students. So drawing on these, through the analysis, I identified 4 mechanisms through which students are produced as what I call stranger students. The first, probably largest theme that came across throughout the interviews was the idea of surveillance and suspicion. So the visa itself is extraordinarily invasive. There's 10-page documents of questions that need to be answered before the visa application is submitted. There's extensive documentation required on submission of the visa application. Documentation is required on arrival to the UK, but also at registration for the university. Students are required to have their attendance taken. At the point of time I undertook the interviews, there was also police registration for some students required. And all in all, it leads to an overall feeling of what one participant described as being paranoid, which is clearly a rational response to the system that treats every gap in his history as a potential threat. Another participant who was a postgraduate student and who was also working as a student advisor told me that many students said that they felt like they were being treated like criminals, having to bring their visa documents so often to prove that they were still entitled to be there. And so in the most extreme cases, one student I interviewed had a friend who had were 3 months from submission of their PhD and had their visa cancelled for missing a single monitoring point. So that threat of removal was really alive throughout the interviews that I analysed. The second large theme that came across in the interviews was discussions on finances, on the cost of the application fee visa being quite expensive, as well as the fact that students were paying higher fees than home students. But they also, the fees also discriminate against students who are potentially bringing family with them and having to pay maintenance fees per dependent as well. perhaps something that is missing in the study, and it's with regards to the economic filtering that Isaac mentioned as well, is the fact that the absent voices are part of the argument here. So the students who actually couldn't afford to come don't make it to the UK, and that kind of prove, or that supports the point that economic filtering doesn't just screen for funds, it ensures that international student mobility remains a privilege of the already very privileged. What I also saw as a mechanism coming throughout the analysis was how far into private life the border reaches. Many students spoke about the implications that their visa had on their family members. One PhD student was forced by her visa conditions to limit her maternity leave to 2 months. And she clarified that this really had quite a large impact on her PhD study, because she was back to work or to study much sooner than she would have preferred to have been after having a baby. Also, family members visiting their students became quite under this feeling of surveillance as well, and this feeling of being questioned. And so an ordinary family visit becomes an occasion for suspicion. And so the border doesn't stop with the student, it also governs their entire intimate world. And then the fourth mechanism that I identified for this paper was the idea of geopolitical differentiation and unequal mobility, which I mentioned at the start of the talk as well. But through visa mechanisms, not all students were able to apply for a visa in the country where they were located at that time. So a Libyan student described to me how she couldn't apply in Libya because the UK processing office there had been closed. So she had to travel to Tunisia to apply for her visa and pay for accommodation while she waited there for the results. I also had a Vietnamese student who described as well how her application was sent to Bangkok to be processed and not done locally. And I suppose it shows that the administrative geography of UK visa processing is global, but it's not neutral. And some students arrive already displaced, already in debt before they've set foot in the UK university. And bringing that all together in the paper, I then go through the effective bordering as a concept that I use to tie these mechanisms together. So what they share is that they don't just restrict or exclude, but they produce a particular kind of subjectivity. And it comes down to someone whose belonging is always conditional and always being demonstrated rather than assumed. And this happens in the university as one of the primary sites where it's enacted. And so what we see is that a university admissions office and a university visa compliance office are not in tension. They're two faces of the same institution. And so that students enter as objects of a political project. They're welcomed economically, but governed with suspicion politically. And just to make a final point, just to say that this is not unique to the UK. We see increasingly stringent visa regimes in many countries across the world, which are all also bringing compliance obligations into university spaces. So that brings me to the end of my talk. I would be very happy to take any questions or to talk to anyone about my paper after the talk as well. Okay, thanks, Jenna.
Great, thank you so much, Aisling. And if you can put a link to your paper as well in the chat, I'm sure colleagues would love to follow up with that.
Okay, thank you.
at the request of our next couple of speakers, I'm going to stop the recording here. So if you're joining us later, thank you for joining us.